will be presented officially today is the outcome of the second phase of the Cool Down project, which has at its heart a collaborative process with a wide group of stakeholders, and it was started 2 years ago. Carbon Market Watch conceived of this Cool Down project to address what we perceive to be a lack of clarity about the role of carbon removals in the climate policy framework. And therefore, the project set out with 2 objectives. The first one was to ensure that carbon removals will not be used to mitigate ongoing emissions. And the principle formulated by the project, therefore, was that there needs to be a separation in policy between emission reductions, biogenic sequestration, and permanent removals. And the second objective was to overcome what we saw at the onset of the project as a polarization of the debate on carbon removals. And we wanted to overcome that polarization by engaging actors from different fields in the co-creation of policy blueprints. So the Cool Down project eventually brought together representatives of those different stakeholder groups, people from academia, from NGOs, and industry. So I'd say it was a pretty novel process. During the first year of the project, the focus was on producing recommendations for the integration of carbon removals in the EU climate law. And it produced on top general recommendations on policy instruments with which to promote and govern carbon removals in the EU. In the second project year, the attention shifted then to home in on the financing of carbon removals. And this was particularly important because currently the financing of permanent carbon removals depends on policies, or looks to depend on policies and initiatives that could actually potentially exacerbate mitigation deterrents. So, for example, the ETS is an existing instrument. It's an emission reduction instrument, but with the integration of removals into the ETS, those emission reduction efforts risk to be weakened. Similarly, for raising money from removals through the voluntary carbon market, there is the risk that companies might offset their emissions with removal units, perhaps to the detriment of their emission reduction efforts. So we therefore set out to examine potential alternatives. And this was done in 2 full-day in-person workshops combined with an editorial process involving a small group of participants. And for this co-creation process in the course of these workshops, we had the expert support on co-creation from the organization called Democracy. Democracy is here at the back today. So now is the moment to present you with the results and to have some discussion on these results. And we will kick off with 2 presentations before moving on to a panel discussion. First, we will hear from Fabiola De Simone, who is carbon removals lead at Carbon Market Watch, who also led the Cool Down project. She will present the co-created proposal for an EU permanent carbon dioxide removal development and delivery framework. It's a long name. And then we have the pleasure of listening to Alice Evatt, who was part of the project from the beginning. And while she has lots of expertise on the content matter, of course, we have asked her today to give a perspective on the relevance of the project and the relevance in particular of the cooperation process at the heart of the project. So over to Fabiola in the first instance.
Monitor.
We have to slide. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I will need to ask my colleagues to know the slides. today. But thank you so much for being here. Sabine, for the introduction. I am Fabiola. I coordinate with the cool down process. Cool down, we can maybe go to the first slide. The second. So cool down is a process which, as Sabine mentioned, started in 2024. The core of the project was that it is a process based on co-creation and on collaboration between different stakeholders. We decided to use this innovative approach because we thought that carbon removal policy was also a kind of new topic, and that there was, as Sabine mentioned, a bit of polarization, and between those who were overconfident in the deployment of removals and those who were maybe over-skeptical and didn't want to, were afraid to address the topic. So how did we decide to do that? Starting from the assumption that yes, we will need to develop a sustainable supply of carbon removals, but this should not come at the expense of reducing emissions. And how can we do that? By having separate targets, by addressing carbon removals separately from emissions reduction, and also further separation between permanent removals and those more temporary removals in the sector. We can go to the next slide. So we started with phase one. Sabine mentioned that it had a broader focus on how carbon removals are kind of addressed in the EU CLIMA framework, and we produced two results. The first one was a proposal to revise the EU CLIMA law, so how carbon removals can actually help the EU CLIMA targets. And the second one is a set of policy recommendations for instruments and permanent removals. We realized, though, that there was still a topic which was quite still quite relevant, which is how do we actually finance removals, and we decided to focus a second phase on how to properly finance specifically permanent removals, again in a way that doesn't compete with decarbonization, doesn't compete with reducing emissions. So the focus of the second phase, we had this question, this challenge: how can we actually do that? How can we finance removals without going down investments to drastically cut emissions? So next slide, please. We had a collective task. As last year, we wanted to produce something that was different from everything that is normally done in the Brussels bubble and the advocacy work, which is providing policymakers with some recommendations, but which were more high level. This time again, we wanted to produce something which was as much as possible close or similar to what the European Commission could propose, and that the Parliament and the Council could also agree on. Because also we realized that many other colleagues were already looking into producing reports and policy recommendations on the topic of financing permanent removal. So we wanted to go a bit further and create a draft or prototype of a legislative proposal, and we came up with this idea of having a framework also in line with the separation of targets approach, to have a separate framework to deal with the financing of permanent removal. So this was our collective task this year. Around 20 people participated in the workshops, but Alice will also talk about this more later. And so we, next slide, how did we get, so we're here because we're presenting the results. This means that we managed to produce something. But how did we actually do that? So during 2 workshops, we started with first, with 3 core principles. This year, it's similar to last year, and the first 2 we already talked about them. No substitutions between emissions and removals, 3 separate targets, and the third one was particularly relevant for this process, which was we are gonna look into alternatives to integration of carbon removals in ETS. Not necessarily because all the participants in this process agree that integration is something that should not be done, it is not a viable policy option, but since there was already a lot of attention on that option, we wanted to look into alternatives. So we agreed with all participants that this process would just be focused on alternatives. And so we, in 2 workshops, we developed some ideas. These slides will need to be, and during workshop 1, we first agreed on the overarching objectives of financing framework for renewables in the EU. What such a framework should aim to achieve. Then we discussed purpose, the scope, what are we gonna regulate with this framework, what types of removals, but also the timeframes. What are the financing needs of removals? Should we design different instruments for the short term and the long term? So we had a discussion about that, and then once we agreed, in workshop 1 we entered the designing of mechanisms, meaning that we looked into the core elements of some policy options, such as again the scope, the governance, the funding, etc. And we agreed together to move forward with some of them. And then in workshop 2, we focused more on the long term. And again, we identified core principles. Should policy options for the long term be based on the polluter pays or rather ability to pay principle? Still environmental integrity, respecting the environmental integrity, social human rights. Then we had presentations from key experts on the different policy options for the long term that were currently on the table. Particularly, it was on the removals trading scheme or compliance scheme, on national targets for member states in the national effort sharing regulations, and also on the emitters, extended emitters responsibility. We had a kind of voting process, and at the end of it, we decided that one of these 3 was more relevant because for this process, because it was matching or like respecting the principles that we had agreed on better. And so we moved forward with the co-drafting, and so drafting legislative text on how can this instrument actually work. Now I think into the presentation. So in between and after the workshops, we a smaller group of people met to streamline the task workshops, because of course, like we got many things, and then we have to just finalize the proposal. And so we have a draft regulation. We don't expect this to be presented to the Parliament and the Council tomorrow for approval, of course. This is just for inspiration, but we hope this is still something that could be interesting to start with. Okay, so we actually are presenting today now a bit into the content, financing a proposal for a new permanent carbon removal development and framework. In the next slide, there is a QR code to the PDF, which you can, if you have your phone, you can access, but it's going to be published on our website soon. So this proposal again is presenting options to establish a framework which address the financing of removals, both in the short term and the long term. In the next slide, we have an overview of the proposals. We love these charts, so I thought that to have like summary and an overview, but I will go into the detail in the next slides. But this is what we suggested. So in the first phase, we suggest to establish a research, development, and innovation initiative, and a new permanent CDR pilot procurement program. This is also in line with the study that was conducted for the European Commission for CLIMA on a procurement program for permanent removals. But then in the longer term, we need to move forward and to set up a compliance scheme, setting obligations for companies to and entities to buy removals. I think we can go to the next slide. I will present again this overview later. So these are the key objectives of the framework. Don't want to repeat myself, but it's very important that we start with the key guiding principles. First, removals have to supplement emissions reduction. We need to ensure the quality of removals that we're regulating, that we're financing. Short-term investments are actually necessary. We need to start sooner rather than later, because we also need to test these methods, and we need to make sure that we avoid any potential negative impacts. But at the same time, we also need to sustain their deployment in the long term. So next slide, please. Yeah. So the overall purpose is, again, to support the development and delivery of high quality permanent removal. We decided that for the scope, we wanted to do a little step further than what is currently in the CRCF. So permanent here, the scope is for removals, to supporting removals that can ensure storage beyond 1,000 years. So still in the definition of permanent removals in the CRCF, but only applying to those methods which can guarantee storage for a longer time. Same thing for the quality criteria. CRCF is a basis. It's where we should start, but there are also some key principles that should be they should complement those included in the CRCF. And this framework is intended primarily for EU activities, but we left open a possibility for third countries to also apply for funding or to bid for the procurement of remote units. Next slide. The first initiative, the first instrument that we suggest for the shorter term is the establishment of an initiative for the research development and innovation in the renewables field. Here, the scope is the idea is to support and coordinate funding for projects, for carbon removals projects with technology readiness level of between 1 and 5. These initiatives would be managed by the EU Commission, and the funding should come from part of a dedicated budget under the multi-annual financial framework, but also the new EU research and innovation succeeding, following Horizon. Then, at the same time, funding can come from member states' contributions, and we also suggest the establishment of regulatory sandboxes to test and develop carbon removals in various states. Then, still for the short term, we have a proposal to set up a pilot procurement program. Where here the scope is to the purpose is to coordinate funding and to procure removal units from a diverse portfolio of methods, but still for project funding for projects with TRL between 6 and 9. The suggested governance here is to have a program a program managed by an existing institution or an agency, and it should be implemented through off-take contracts with operators. We suggest that the units purchased by this entity, EU agency managing this program, should be used towards the UNDC through climate targets and permanent removals targets. And then funding, we suggest that there should be a dedicated, again, EU stream for permanent removals, including streams from existing instruments based on previous case, for example, the Indonesia. At the same time, again, member states should and could voluntarily contribute to this program by contributing funding, and in exchange they could get units that can be used for their national removal targets, if any. When it comes to private parties, private companies, also their contribution is welcome. And here in exchange, differently from what member states could do, in order to avoid offsetting, the suggestion is to give companies certificates to be used towards potential monetary targets for permanent removal, saying I contributed this amount of money to meet my country or this country removal target. Then for the longer term, next slide please, still on these two elements, of course, there was a lot to regulate, to say about how these two instruments should function and be implemented. So an idea was to suggest the Commission to propose delegated acts to establish further rules on how these two instruments can be implemented and operationalized, what the application process should be, but also specificity about the eligibility of methods, financing for purchasing, but also how the agencies, EU agencies would assess and evaluate the applications and bids, but also the allocation of funds. So there's a bit more like details on this in the actual proposal, but this is something that we would ask the Commission. And then for the longer term, we decided to suggest the setting, the establishment of a removals compliance scheme in Europe. This was based also on studies and reports that participants also had conducted on this policy option. Here again, since it was a process with many participants, it was hard to agree on one specific scope for the removals compliance scheme. So which kind of companies should be obligated to purchase removal credits? We in the proposal have some options, but we didn't decide on one. But still, there's some food for thought there. But what we suggest is that the Commission should propose a legislative proposal based on principles such as polluter pays, the ability to pay, equity, responsibility criteria, but also the extent of residual emissions. Here again, for the use of units, they should be used by those companies to fulfill their obligations, but then they should be then used towards EU climate targets, and they should not be used towards offsetting, or offsetting. And then the governance, we suggest the establishment of what we call the central purchasing and reselling platform. This platform would be a central platform with manages and oversees the removals units within the market. It purchases the units from a variety of methods, and so that the removals credits would be made of different portions of removals units, but also would address liability issues, and it would ensure the delivery of sufficient permanent removals in line with these potential and residual emissions in the EU. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is, I came to the end of my presentation. This is again the overview of what we suggest. This was a very interesting process. I think we came up with some concrete ideas. Of course, many details need to be developed. We don't assume that we found the solution to everything. But yeah, you can find the proposal online on our website, and if you have any questions, reach out. I think that this was my last slide. Okay, that's right. Yes, thank you. I don't know if there is any clarification question right now. Otherwise, we can also keep them for Q&A later. And I give the floor to Alice for presentation on the process.
Okay. I will, yeah. I'm just taking a minute to fix the sound as well for participants online, since there seems to be an issue. Yes. I think this should be working. I'm just checking for the sound again once more. I'm sorry. Check with you which one is the sound that is here.
Yep, that one.
Echo channeling?
Yes, yes.
Channeling.
See, that's like
Okay. Now it should work better. Sorry, you can go on.
Okay. My name is Alice Evatt, and I have to say I was really excited when Fabiola and Cabinato Watch asked me to speak today, because kind of a not so secret is that for the whole process I've been kind of the #1 fan of this. And I think I made that quite clear. And so everything I say today, I suppose, is a bit biased towards this co-creation process, but I want to walk you through it and tell you why I think it just works so well. So I'm from the inside, right? So I'm going to give you the inside perspective. I'm just going to walk you through basically what it was, what cool down was, phase 1 and phase 2, and what I think some of the takeaways for EU policy development on permanent CDR is. So a bit of background about who I am and why I'm standing here. So I'm Alice Evatt, and I'm a research fellow at Oxford Net Zero at the University of Oxford, and work alongside Professor Miles Allen, who's been a trailblazer in the space of net zero and geological storage. And so we work on policy mechanisms for scaling permanent removals, CDR in general, and also geological storage. And for those that are interested to look at our work, we're particularly keen on mandates. But as an academic, I've been to a lot of workshops, and straight away, especially when we had this activity, I knew cool down was not the typical workshop. Right? Usually in workshops, you get presentations, round tables, perhaps even breakouts. This was unlike anything I've ever been to before. So you can see here, one of the activities was holding this stick. If you go to the next slide. You can see in the background, we were broken up into different groups, and the aim was to, with only one finger touching the stick at all times, groups have to bring it from the top and get it down to the bottom. And the person who got it down to the ground floor first won. And so I was thinking, what an easy task. I would just do it and go down. And it was terribly difficult. If you can go to the next slide. I believe this was the winning group, who I have to say were incredibly impressive.
You cheated, sorry.
Oh my goodness. But I think, and if you go to the final slide. Now I was picked on this day to, maybe because our group lost, but I was picked on to explain why were we doing this task? How is this relevant to developing quite a serious topic, permanent CDR in the EU? And apart from it demonstrating how difficult it is to get emissions from up here to net zero, right? It also really showed at the core what co-creation does. And so it reveals that, genuine coordination, even if the task might look simple, is quite difficult to actually get in person. And so climate policy runs into the similar problems with, there's broad agreement, but how you actually get to the specifics and get that coordination is difficult. I think it also shows how individual behavior of each member shifts when you realize that you're actually interdependent and have to work together as a team. You can't just have one person drop down, because then that's breaking the rules. And climate action, I think, only works when actors realize that the whole system is interconnected, and we can't just push forward a single agenda, we have to work together. The next is that it created a low-stakes friction, maybe at the time it felt like high-stakes friction. But what that did is it builds collaboration and trust in a kind of safe space for you to be able to get behind the ideas you're developing. And finally, I think that it shows really that coordination comes first, and then speed comes after. So if we can all work on getting together and co-creating, then we can really get some traction and speed going in policy development. So that's my take on the overall co-creation or process and mechanism. Yeah.
It's really late, sorry.
Oh.
There you go.
So what is cool down? I think for me, it's not just a few policy groups. We've got 2 from phase 1, 1 from phase 2. But really, I see the whole project as a multi-year, multi-stakeholder and structured co-creation process. It is based on the theory of co-creation, and we've got Sabine from Dreamocracy here today, who's written fantastic work on this. It's grounded. What does it mean, co-creation? It's grounded in principles of mutual benefit and collective progress. And it's an inclusive and participatory process that has formed collaborations and trust between such a wide group of stakeholders. You've got academia, you've got industry, you've got NGOs and society.
Almost there. There we go.
The phase one, so I won't go into too much detail because Fabiola has already walked us through it, but it had 48 participants, which is quite significant. And again, across a huge range, facilitated the first session by the Institute of Participatory Design, 3 full-day workshops, and again, an editorial group that came together. Yeah, those are the 2 outputs. So the workshop, I've already spoken about what workshops normally entail, presentations. The whole policy process was a lot faster than this PowerPoint. It involved, round tables, etc. Breakouts. But it also had interspersed these strange activities that actually worked really well. I already told you about the stick. This one here is, you had picked on, so there was a lot of picking on it, this workshop, but to create a funny face and everyone does it, actually kind of really immediately you get quite comfortable with each other. There was one activity where we had to silently align ourselves in a line and organize ourselves based on the year and month of our birthdays without speaking. And so we got there pretty quickly, actually. Yeah. So phase 2 was quite different from phase 1. Right? Phase 1 was about developing the grand kind of architecture of our position on permanent carbon removal. Phase 2 is a smaller group, 25 participants, key stakeholders, facilitate this time by democracy. 2 full-day workshops, an editorial group, and it resulted in the brief that's being published today. It involved everything I've already said, plus really kind of different activities that enabled us to bring out different ideas. Picture there was, white papers are organized, you stick different notes on, you can see there's a whole lot in there. That's us developing the post-its to stick on. One of my favorite things, which I've actually, I don't want to say stolen, but been inspired by to take back to Oxford in our workshops, is the use of mural boards, which had us all kind of organized in groups. You write down your ideas and you can interact with each one. In particular, I really liked that people were hearting work on supporting mandates in policies, which is completely not biased. But so just to kind of conclude and finish up, I wanted to reflect, what does co-creation add that standard policy design and even just general collaboration misses sometimes? And for me, I think that it's really, you can genuinely say that the outputs are co-owned. Right? You can have your voice put into it. The differing perspectives are treated not as kind of negatives, but very important pieces and recorded. And it can show the process of coming to a shared position. The editorial group was not just a team of Carl's Market Watch, it also involved participants and several iterations. Why does it matter for EU decision-making and CDR policy? So 2 things, I think. The first is that the cool down project as a whole shows like the pipeline for European CDR governance. Next. See here, phase 1, establishing the conceptual architecture, and next. Leads quite simply, and you can see the thought process when you build all the policy groups together,
into a more concrete legislative proposal and inspiration that can be used in policy making. I also think that, sorry if I can't read this quite well, EU CDR governance requires, what does it require? Scientific legitimacy, political acceptability, stakeholder alignment, and robust policy architecture. It's a lot to do, right? And policy takes a lot of time to develop. And I think this might be a bold claim. I think co-creation is quite quickly, right? So the timeline of the phase in particular is just over a month. I think it creates legitimacy for plan policy. I think it produces convergence across groups that normally disagree. I think it allows, and hopefully will allow, for the EU to design robust CDR in a domain that's really filled with uncertainty. There's technologies still developing, there's different frameworks, there's different groups out there. This is essentially to sped through a process, bringing disparate groups together and getting, to begin with, some consensus that we can get the ball rolling. Consensus, exactly, and co-ownership. One back. I've said that EU institutions can reliably absorb. And what I mean by that is, okay, you can see the groups involved in this. You can see it's very transparent process on how this was created. And so that can make it faster to absorb. And finally, I think, and it was mentioned in the opening presentation, that one of the biggest problems when talking about CDR is this threat of mitigation deterrence, which I think is one of the most serious issues confronting the development of CDR. And I think that this co-creation process can really help avoid that deterrence because of the particular stakeholders it brought around. NGOs to ensure that the strong guardrails are there, academics to hopefully ensure the scientific integrity, industry to contribute, what is actually feasible, and finally civil society to shape those really important justice dimensions and people perspectives. And so that's it. And I think for me, I really stand by what I say, that this was a process unlike any that I've been involved in before, and that I'm going to be learning a lot from. And yeah, I highly encourage all of you to develop your projects too. Thank you.
This might have been very biased. Hang on a moment. Extremely biased, yeah. This might have been. This might have been a highly biased statement, but I think it was a very well reasoned one. So thank you very much for that. Let's move on to discuss some of the details in the proposal with our panel. May I ask our panelists to come to the stage, please? So who do we have here? We have 3 participants from the process, representing the different stakeholder groups. So we have Francesca Battersby, who is Senior Policy Analyst at Carbon Gap, and her areas of expertise there include financing mechanisms for CDR across the innovation lifecycle and the development of CDR compliance markets. I think you joined in the second half, but you certainly saw a good portion of the process. Then we have Atilla Yucel, who is also sort of industry representative, shall we say. He is program manager for carbon removal financing at the Negative Emissions Platform, which is an industry association. He works there with 60 member companies to advance financing strategies for permanent CDR at EU, but also at country level. I think you also joined a bit later, but there was continuity of representation from the negative emissions platform throughout the project. And then we have Silke and Mooldijk, who, shall we say, represents research and academia on the panel here. Silke is a researcher and expert at the NewClimate Institute, and she focuses on corporate climate responsibility, net zero targets, climate action in the aviation sector, and Paris Agreement Article 6 finance. That's quite a lot to be an expert on. Thanks all for being here. So here are our three participants of the process, and then of course the outcomes need a recipient. And one of the representatives of the recipient institutions here from the European Commission is Fabien Ramos, who is lead on carbon removals at the Unit for Land Economy and Carbon Removals at DG CLIMA of the European Commission. Fabien, you've already listened when we presented, you're already here to receive, so to speak, the results of the first round of the project. You are here again. Thank you very much. You were in terms of preparation, you're definitely the best person here to have on the panel. We also try to get MEPs, by the way, but the process isn't far along, shall we say, in EU terms, for this to be interesting to MEPs at the moment. The institution that counts is the European Commission for the reception of those ideas. So, Fabien, you're meant to be inspired by this proposal. Are you inspired? Is the European Commission inspired? We have a 2040 target proposal that is the basis for the upcoming trilogue negotiations. They themselves, or this proposal itself, does not actually elaborate much on the role of permanent carbon removals in achieving the 2040 target. What's on the cards is mainly an integration of CDR in the ETS. Let me ask provocatively, is the EU capable at the moment of thinking beyond this idea of CDR integration in the ETS? How do you see the proposal for the creation of this overall dedicated framework for carbon removals? Does it fit? Can it fit the architecture, the climate architecture of the EU? Sorry, that was many questions in one, but you get the gist, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sabine, for this invitation to discuss today this topic. My short answer to your question will be yes, the EU is capable to look beyond simply the integration of the ETS. I'm going to try to elaborate a little bit on that today. You mentioned the climate law. Yes, we are at a very important moment. We know that the member states have agreed on the position for the climate law. We know that the Parliament also agreed on the position on the climate law, and the two positions are very close. So we are very hopeful that very soon we'll get an adoption of this climate law. What is in? You said it. One of the key aspects is the potential links that we have to assess between the ETS and the carbon removals. But I would say, beyond that, in the previous version of the climate law, permanent carbon removals, that's how you call them, permanent technological, etc., were not mentioned at all, and were outside the scope of the climate law. So already the fact that in this version of the climate law, there is a recognition of this type of carbon removal beside natural-based solution, I think it is already very important. There is a link to the ETS, but also we know that next year we'll come with several proposals. First, the ETS will come first before the summer, and after we'll look at member state targets. Today we have the sharing regulation, we have LULUCF. Let's see what kind of ideas we can have when we propose the next generations, let's say, of a member state's target. We'll work also a lot on many other policies that are related to this. There is a governance policy, there is our colleague from DG Energy that will look at renewable energy, etc. So many things coming, and it's not only about the ETS. Now, on your proposal, I think your proposal, well, I like it very much. There is everything that we need in this proposal. The scope, first, you make sure that we are using only good carbon removals, high quality carbon removals. I was quite pleased to see that you are building on the CLCF, and at the end, you didn't have too much on the top of the CLCF. You added DNSH criteria. I think, if I remember correctly, there is also mention of DNSH criteria in the CLCF. Additionality, okay, we can have a very long discussion on additionality, and human rights. I saw that in your text you were referring to avoid slavery, forced work, etc. I hope that in Europe we have the rules and the legislation for that, and we are not about to use CSCF, but that's a good point. And why I say that is because, as you know, CSCF is EU-only activities, while I suppose in your mind you were also looking outside Europe, and that's why these elements are very important. And it opens the question also, what about, should we make a distinction between carbon removals that are taking place in Europe and carbon removals that are taking place outside Europe, or the discussion in international credits, etc. But beyond that, yes, you're absolutely right. We need research and development. We need to continue to find support on that. The next MFF, or the discussion on the MFF proposal by the Commission earlier this year, before the summer, is very important. Let's see what will be the final shape of this framework, of the multi-annual financial framework. I'm very much in favor of developing a pilot program. So let's see how we call that: pilot procurement program, pilot purchasing program. But these programs are very important. Why? Because the research and development support that the European Commission and the European institution can bring focus on low-TRL activities, and it's important that we fill the gap between low-TRL activities and fully commercial activities, so TRLs between 6 and 8, 9. And I think this is what you have in mind with this pilot program. And to support them, what I think is very important, it should not be grants, it's also could help a lot on that. So maybe I can come back to this later in our discussion. And finally, the key elements, what else than integration on ETS? You propose a renewable carbon scheme, I think, I'm not sure, carbon renewal scheme. Yes, but of course, we need to see how we can do that. I see that in your proposal, you don't say exactly who is going to pay, and I'm sure you had a lot of discussion on potential who we should target with this kind of initiative. Alice, that is coming from our sport and working together with Marie-Hélène, I'm sure brought the CTBO, so the carbon tobacco obligation discussion. I'm personally very curious if something could be done at this level, but maybe this is the kind of thing that could take time. So in your work, I think you have everything. I also know that towards 2050, we will need something else than just integration in ETS for carbon removal, because at a certain point there will not be emission anymore, and we'll need to go for negative emissions. And for that, we'll need an instrument. But I think if I agree that we need all the things that you have designed in your proposal, I think the timeline to implement that is very important, and also the context and to solve more issues on who is going to pay for carbon removals.
Okay, that sounds very encouraging, doesn't it? It sounds something like will be put in the policy pipeline, and something might come out of the policy pipeline sooner rather than later. Thank you for that. I forgot to announce that we will have a Q&A, and that is an invitation to you here in the room to ask questions, but also for the people online to put questions into the Q&A, and we will pick up as many as possible from there. Let me turn to Silke. The proposal that we present today envisages a leading role for EU public authorities to regulate the financing of permanent removals in support of their development. So it's at the heart of it is a proposal for a public role, for an EU role, compared to the role of companies and voluntary initiatives in driving the demand for CDR. How crucial is this public role?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think my answer consists of two parts. Why are the EU and also national governments important? And then two, what is the limitation that voluntary initiatives face? So to start with the crucial role of the EU and governments, I think CDR should be considered a public good because it's a scarce resource that we need to limit global warming. It's also, CDR also has negative implications on water resources, for instance. It competes with renewable electricity, with other sectors for renewable electricity. It may have implications for biodiversity. So there are a lot of potential trade-offs, and I think it's really important that society has collective ownership over this scarce resource and decides what projects they want and also what trade-offs are acceptable. And here I think governments have a really key role to play in driving the decision-making process. This also includes setting limits on how much emissions there can be in sectors to avoid that companies over-rely on CDR that may never materialize. They also have an important role to play in monitoring the storage of CO₂ and assigning liability. What happens if stored CO₂ leaks back into the atmosphere again? Who is to pay? This is also something where governments really have a crucial role. There's also a role for governments in actually holding companies accountable and letting them pay. And also in driving finance, and there are many options of how this can be done. Personally, I'm not well enough into the EU policy space to have a concrete recommendation myself, but there are options like integration in the ETS, removal scheme at the national level taxation. So these are all different options. Then moving to the second part of my question, the limitations of voluntary initiatives. Well, it's already in the terminology, they're voluntary. So they can't set the bar very high because then companies will not participate. I'm part of the expert working group on removals of the Science Based Targets initiative. So I'm advising the SBTi on rules for removals in their net zero standard. And there is a lot of, also in this group, a lot of pressure from private, from companies to weaken the rules, because if the bar is really high, companies will not participate, and that's really a challenge that voluntary standards face. Not that they need to balance scientific interests, also social and justice considerations, and then business interests. And I think they're able to really mobilize corporate climate action, but they're not able to set the bar high enough, and this is where governments should step in and play a bigger role.
Okay, so definitely a double role for public authorities, both to create the obligations and to solve the infrastructure challenges. Thank you for that. Atilla, let me turn to you. We want to get a feel for how companies might receive this proposal, what importance it might have for them. And for that, we need to understand, first of all, where companies that generate permanent removals stand today. What are their financing needs, the needs they struggle with, and how do the different elements of the proposal relate to those needs?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. First of all, thank you and congratulations to everyone on the team for the launch of this paper and for having also had us in the process in the participatory workshop, Marie, my colleague, members from DRAX and others. So thank you very much for this. I'd like to briefly take a step back, if that's okay, because we're coming out of COP30 in Berlin. And on the one hand, it seems to me that the scientific community has never been as vocal as it is now about ocean management, something very concerning. And I'm sure, or I suppose many of you have read it from and heard from Johan Bergström speaking about the role of CDR. In fact, the 200 to 220 gigatons of CDR that will likely be required just to reduce a 1/10 of a degree of Celsius this century. On the other hand, we are witnessing more and more climate-related impacts. Just this week, again, reportedly 1,000 people died in landslides caused by floods and extreme rainfall in Southeast Asia. And so I'm saying this because I think it is these realities that really matter for today's conversations. Europe's leadership in durable carbon dioxide removal has both, in my opinion, a moral imperative and a strategic dimension to it. And so, for instance, take the EU's projected need for permanent CDR, which is, I think, 100 megatons of CO₂ removed through industrial removals by 2050. That sits within a global requirement of 6 to 10 gigatons. And so I think much of the science technology innovation that will be developed here will be required globally. So that leads me to your question. I believe markets on their own, and thanks for confirming this, cannot deliver these outcomes, in my opinion, for three reasons. Firstly, there is the tragedy of the horizon, to quote from Mark Carney. We see investors that optimize for short-term gains, whereas carbon dioxide really delivers outcomes in 10, 15, and plus years. Projects that is. Secondly, dual externalities. I mean, clean tech in particular suffers from knowledge spillovers and the alternatives and fossil fuels not being their externalities not being priced adequately. And there's lastly, in my opinion, I fully agree, permanent CDR, in my opinion, is a public good. It's a waste management problem, essentially, and public goods have rarely scaled with private investment alone. So, in fact, we believe from the negative emissions platform that Europe needs a CDR strategy. And we need a CDR strategy that starts with specific targets for permanent CDR. And I think your policy proposal provides very fundamental building blocks for such a strategy. Now, where do companies stand today? I can report, and I will report to you from a survey that is currently ongoing. These are live results. The sample size is 0.6. We've been surveying our startups and scale-ups and permanent CDR, and the picture is remarkably consistent. Overall, our teams, the companies that we surveyed, plan to scale their capacity by an order of magnitude from now until 2030. That aligns with the Commission's recent study finding, which says that we need to move from 0.6 megatons of permanent CDR today to around 5 megatons of permanent CDR by 2030. But there are three top barriers. First of all, lack of long-term policy certainty. Secondly, lack of demand. And thirdly, lack of long-term capital. Now, overall, we identified also a funding gap. So the funding need that we identified for both CAPEX, so capital expenditure, operational expenditure, for these companies by 2030 is a total of 5 billion, at least 5 billion euros, that is. However, it's also important to bear in mind that volumes differ significantly across pathways. So, for example, I'm sure you know that there are larger CAPEX projects like indirect air capture. There's projects which have larger operational expenditures like in biochar. I think as a rule of thumb, we can see that projects at the lower end of the technology readiness level, like OAE, Ocean Affordability Enhancement, are super happy with just 10 million euros in grants or 20 million euros in grants just for research and development. On the other spectrum, we see commercial or near commercial pathways like DAX and BAX, for example, that really need hundreds, 200s, and plus million of euros in project finance just to establish their next plant. And then you can see an interesting or observe an interesting pattern, which is about just somewhere between there, so between like 50 to 200 million euros. Now, the proposal that you've put forward, you presented, relates to these needs, in my opinion, in two fundamental ways. Firstly, it's, I think, worth mentioning that it stresses the need for a portfolio of CDR methods. That is, of course, to expand the total potential, to reduce the trade-offs between individual pathways. And secondly, and it's very important, we need a mix of policy tools that can cater to these different needs in the different CDR technologies. And so we believe there's no single instrument that will close this gap across the board from our startups and scale-ups. We hear the need for three things, which are reflected in your policy proposal. First of all, more research and development. These are your Horizon Europe's and European Innovation Council, the European Competitiveness Fund going forward. But also, let's not forget the European Investment Bank, which can provide crucial deployment support through guarantees. Secondly, we need an EU program that can facilitate and incentivize private purchases. And lastly, we are longing for a pathway toward a long-term mandatory demand signal, which really can sustain private investments in scaling up the levels and bringing costs down in permanent CDR. I think it is this combination of supply push and demand pull that the sector needs in order to really get to a level of net zero and then net negative. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. I mean, thank you for recalling the urgency of the challenge to scale up CDR, the scope in particular of this challenge, and outlining the needs of industry and the many different tools that are needed here in the different timescales. The proposals, as was outlined, that are contained in the overall proposal have different timeframes. With Francesca now, I want to take a look at the long term, at the most long-term oriented proposal that is contained in the overall proposal. That is the removals compliance scheme, which is supposed to serve us in the medium to long term. So we're talking from 2030 onwards to 2040 towards 2050. That is a core element of the proposal. What are the challenges of establishing such a scheme? Are they surmountable? How costly can it be? And what could be the scope of such a scheme?
Yeah, big question. So I hope you don't mind if I I've got some notes because I want to make sure that I structure my response. But yeah, it is a huge and complex question. I think so Carbon Gap's been looking at this idea for a lot of 2025, and so that's why it was really exciting to be part of this cool down process, which, you know, I was very glad that the removal compliance scheme was voted to be kind of the long-term demand that we pursued. Our kind of motivation for looking at this was driven by not necessarily in opposition to the ETS. In fact, we're quite in favour of ETS integration as a near-term lever, but recognising that we don't want to just look at ETS as a foregone conclusion, but expand the set of options. But also, as a third element, kind of recognising ETS as a long-term market for CDR probably has some limitations. You know, ETS is not meant to last decades into the future. It's meant to come to an end. It's meant to decline in scale. It's not meant to be super reliable in terms of price. So how can we think about an alternative market that CDR can actually be invested in against, if that makes sense? So yeah, this RCS concept, a removal compliance scheme, is really rooted in that idea of needing demand, the ETS maybe not being enough, and also really crucially, this kind of underpinning idea that the private sector should pay, which I think underpins a lot of these discussions. I know Silke, you kind of talked about this idea of public good, and I think that's super important. But then the question is, how do you fund that, and sort of who are the actors involved in kind of contributing to that? Though of course we did discuss some other options like a member state level obligation, and this extended emitter responsibility as well. So we need to keep the options open. Coming to your point then about the challenges, there are many, and I've kind of, after this year of work, probably left with more questions than answers, I have to say. Just to name a few, I think, thinking about the rationale, why are we intervening to establish a removals mandate? Is that based on the idea that polluters need to pay for CDR? And if so, which polluters? Is it based on the idea that the richest in the economy should pay for CDR? And if so, who are those people or firms? Aside from rationale, closely related to the point is then scope. Who are the actual covered entities within the system? And we spend a lot of time, I think, going back and forth on whether that should be ETS entities. Is that ETS 1 entities, ETS 2 entities? Should we look beyond the ETS, recognising that ETS entities are, of course, already subject to carbon pricing, and therefore is that fair to introduce an additional obligation? Or if we're pursuing an ability to pay approach, would that be large firms? Would that be wealthy firms? And if so, is that based on turnover? Is that based on profits? Is that based on assets? So there's already lots to think about, and I think these things kind of seem maybe easier on the surface than they are in reality. Then we have kind of things like the relationship of a CDR obligation to existing carbon pricing, which I already mentioned, but also to things like other existing decarbonisation policies, such as the Net Zero Industry Act obligation to invest in carbon geological storage. I think there was kind of an instinctive desire in the group, and I think rightly so, I support it, to get fossil fuel producers and importers to pay for CDR, and I think that's reasonable. But a question we kept coming up against is those emitters are already subject to carbon pricing. They already are subject to a decarbonisation obligation indirectly through the ETS, and therefore, how do you kind of introduce a CDR obligation in relation to that? There's how do you design an obligation? Is it based on a tax, as Silke mentioned? Is it based on a mandate to participate in a market? Is it based on a pricing system? But I think finally, and the most important thing for me, is what's the actual mandate politically for Europe to intervene or for member states to intervene, especially given the competitiveness narrative we have at the moment. How do we go about introducing an additional, potentially expensive obligation on firms if we are planning to target firms in this current economy? And what underpins that? Is it a CDR target? Do we have a separate CDR target? I'm not sure. And what's our kind of underpinning principles in the EU about how to pay? Is that polluters or otherwise? So I think those are the most important first order issues for this. And again, going through this process, there are of course second order issues then, like who's liable in case obligations are not met? What are penalties there? How do you design the system? Which methods are eligible for compliance? Do you have an intermediary institution that to manage this? But I think the most important things to get right are who pays and why, and what's the political sort of mandate for intervening to establish this market. And just to conclude, I think what this is not easy, and there's not a quick solution. And I think what's great about what the cool down draft has done is to say, let's create a hook for this, that the Commission should present a proposal by 2030 to do this. We don't need to have answers now, but we need a political mandate to intervene eventually, because this is a long-term play. We need to get it right. So yeah, I don't want to talk too long, so I could go on to
Thanks a lot. Well, to have consensus on the need for a removals compliance scheme is already something, and to have all the questions on the table that need to be solved is another. And yeah, there's no mean challenge there, but that's what we have the Commission for, to address such challenges. Fabien, I won't ask you on the challenges of the introduction of the removals compliance scheme next. I want to turn to the nearer term proposals again, in particular the one for the public procurement program. We have it in the cool down proposal, but the Commission itself has also commissioned some studies, and one of them was on the creation of a public procurement program. So how do the two sit together? And also with those two other studies that you have commissioned, can we expect now a Commission work stream on financing permanent removals on the back of these studies? So I'm pushing you a bit more now on what exactly we can expect from the Commission, other than general appreciation of the proposals and willingness to consider them.
Yeah, I'll try to bring some answers. First, a quick reaction on the removal compliance scheme. Yes, I fully agree with everything you say, and I appreciate very much that you present nice principle and you give the Commission the privilege to tackle all the very difficult challenges that we identify. So thank you very much. No, to go back to your questions, yes. So before landing on this remote compliance system, in your proposal, yes, you have something on research and innovation and something on a procurement program. Well, I call it procurement. You mentioned our own study on the purchasing program, and I think that the two are going together a little bit. There is some part of overlap between both of them. So what have we done there? You mentioned the study, and so yes, we conducted a study on that, what kind of design we could think about for such a purchasing program. Lucia, that is in the room, is working closely with the team developing this study. Our intention is definitely not to stop there, and to continue this work, to continue to discuss on these aspects and to try to put in place something. We have already announced in the bioeconomy strategy last week that the European Union, the European Commission, intends to push for what we call a barriers club to promote the partnership, public-private partnership, to finance nature-based solutions and permanent carbon removal. So the Bio Club is not only for permanent carbon removal, it covers both, or maybe two Bio Clubs. Let's see how we do that. But so if it's in the bioeconomy strategy, it clearly means that this is something that on which we want to progress, and we want to put in place something. And the discussion with the private sectors, with member states, is going to be very important. And this is another element that I like in your proposal and all the things that you addressed in your proposal is you underline the fact that it's important not to think only about EU funding, but also to look at other sources of funding. You are talking about member state, you are talking about the private sector, and we need to look at, yes, how public money, EU public money could leverage more actions also from other actors that could play a very important role in this. In terms of research and development, what do we have in Europe? We have, of course, the Horizon Europe program, and it will continue under probably potentially a slightly different form and with the next multi-annual financial framework. We have the Innovation Fund that is very important, and we stay. And we already financed some projects in the Innovation Fund. And the successful project of the Innovation Fund, when you look at them, you see that they need not only the grant of the Innovation Fund, but they need also state aid, and they need also private finance. And for us, this is really the model that we want to follow, the template that we think is important to use in the future for the forthcoming projects. We'll need to discuss with the private sector, and this is what we are doing. So people that are interested in buying and here, in taking some ownership somehow of carbon removal. And I understand that in your proposal you are not looking in a very positive way the potential for offsetting, and you are very cautious on that. But we are also to recognize if some private company try to be pioneers on that, to finance carbon removal, to put a lot of effort to help the development of carbon removals. Somehow it's also quite natural to think that they would like to have a bit of recognition for that. And we need to see how best we can do that. We also want to discuss with banks to see how we could facilitate the access to finance, how a various club, what could be the role of the Commission to facilitate the access to finance. And we want to, so we want to have all these discussions, and this will be in the context of these initiatives on developing a various club. What will be the next step? Next year we'll try to organize some events to put also to see if there is a need to facilitate discussion between suppliers and potential users. I know that the negative emission platform is working on that a lot, and they are organizing an event on this. So can we complement this kind of action? Is there a useful role for the European Commission on that? We also want, and it's not exactly in the context of this pilot program, but somehow a little bit to discuss also with the member states, and not only member states. I will say we need to look also outside the European Union. What could be the role of the different jurisdictions, the different countries that are willing to support the development of carbon removals, and how we can coordinate our action. There is some example, for instance, of procurement or purchasing program. In the past, we had one under the previous administration in the US. Canada is trying to do something. Australia might be also interested, maybe some member state as well. So to try to see what is working well and to get inspired by what they are doing. So this is also something that we could see to design this, to give access to this bio to everyone that really wants to participate, to put in place a purchasing program where you can have different sources of finance, public, private, and to see also potentially important when we link carbon removal to our climate policies, what could be the role of this purchasing program, how this purchasing program could evolve from a pilot phase, mainly initially targeted to private sector or in a voluntary context, towards the tool that will help the integration of carbon removal in compliance policies in the future.
Thanks a lot. Francesca, how does all this sound to you? And if you were to comment on the two shorter term components of the proposal, what do you think is the significance? And from now on, I have to ask you for shorter answers because time is getting a bit scarce.
I'll keep it brief, sure. Yeah, I think the long-term scheme does not work well if we don't have these early interventions. I think they're critical for diversifying the portfolio, enabling small-scale actors to come forward that play a part in this EU innovation story that CDR can feed into, avoiding concentration of market power into large players and allowing us to be a really sort of diverse, innovative sector, as well as obviously like cost reduction, things, process improvement, R&D, and support your procurement program for small-scale pilots. I think is absolutely critical to success later on. Just on the public procurement, I think we really welcome this Buyers Club announcement, and that's a really important step forward. It's nice to see that this study that was put forward, set of studies that was put forward in the summer on the procurement program, is actually beginning to be translated into policy. So we're super happy about that. We'd obviously like to see other elements of that come forward that were set out in the study. It doesn't surprise anyone to hear that we would like a small but catalytic commitment from EU funding, from the EU envelope. We'd like this centralised procurement agency that will aggregate member state funding to be brought forward. And we also think that this component that Ecologic put forward of additional services which help to de-risk the private purchases are really, really important. So we'd like to see that develop. We'll be seeing what happens next year. But yeah, I think procurement purchasing to create a demand signal for those small-scale pilots and to help private money come into those and develop markets. Super important. I think Fabien said that a number of times. So.
Thank you very much. And I'll combine my penultimate question to Atilla and to Silke. I want to draw attention once more to the voluntary carbon market and what's going on there already with regard to permanent removals. What is being generated there in terms of units? What is the uptake there? What kind of monetary flows are generated? How does this look from say an academic perspective, but also how companies perceive it and how does it serve companies' needs so far?
Thanks.
If you can, I'll keep it short. Thank you.
Yeah, so most of the carbon credits on the voluntary markets are still from reduction projects, but we see that removals are becoming more important. And that NewClimate, each year we assess the climate strategies of 20 to 25 major companies, and also there, it's a bit more anecdotally, but we see that companies say that removals are important because they need removals to get to net zero, so it's shifting a bit. But at the same time, virtually all removals that are currently on the VCM, voluntary carbon markets, are from non-permanent CDR, so that's afforestation, soil carbon sequestration, etc. And only few companies are investing in durable removals. Just to get some context, Microsoft alone is responsible for over 2/3 of all the permanent CDR ever contracted. So if they were to step out, there's, you could say, no market left. So in terms of scaling up, there is a lot to do. Maybe if I can just quickly add, I think also there is, these companies like Microsoft, they get a lot of praise because they invest in technologies that we need to get to net zero. They're spending a lot of money. But what is the other side of the story that doesn't get so much attention is, again, the broader environmental and social implications of these projects. And we looked at Microsoft earlier this year and looked into some of their biggest projects. So one, bioenergy with CCS in Louisiana in the US, and then biochar in Bolivia. And for both of these projects, neither Microsoft nor the project developers say where the biofeedstocks come from, how they're cultivated, what implications it has on local communities. And I think this is really also a blind spot that as the climate community we should be more critical. And maybe with that I'll end it.
Well, thank you so much. I'll just directly add on top of that. So yes, the voluntary carbon market for removal credits is somehow there and it's working for some. But what worries me really is what the BCM statistics don't show us. And so I don't think it's really working for many of our startups and scale-ups in urban CDR. Here's some anecdotal evidence from our surveys that I mentioned earlier today. So first of all, the first field is the hardest. There's a clear divide between haves and have-nots. So those basically who have made a first deal and those who haven't, because we hear stories from projects telling us that buyers tend to resort and always go back to those who at least have a track record, some track record in supplies. And so that first deal is really, really tough for many projects out there. And we assume that's due to a lack of confidence in the framework and policy signals. Now, secondly, those who are in the market for voluntary purchases, they still need to cope and combine several revenue streams in order to make ends meet. This is where revenue stacking comes in, what I think you mentioned also, Fabien. Project suppliers need to combine several resources or sources, EU support, state aid, and then still revenue streams from the voluntary carbon market. And then lastly, those who simply can't make it in the VCM are forced to rely more and more heavily on other revenue streams. For example, we see suppliers selling their biochar or physical CO₂ or heat and power. So these are additional revenue streams for projects, for technologies who can actually deliver co-benefits or byproducts. But there are, of course, technologies who can't do that. And so these technologies tend to expand horizontally into other lines of businesses by, for example, providing a platform for removal credits from other sources. So just to conclude, I think with this final remark in your question, so in this divide between voluntary and compliance, I believe that we, as I said earlier, we do need a compliance market, but we're not strictly focused on the ETS integration itself. Yes, we do publicly support the assessment of integrating permanent CDR into the ETS, because for many it is a safe bet, and there's a tendency to path dependence. But I would also like to see impact assessments that take into account all options on the table, and so I'm glad to hear what we're hearing today. I believe, or the industry that I represent believes that a mandatory long-term demand signal is needed, and is needed as soon as 2030 in order to get those projects to final investment decisions that are currently in the field. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a nice segue to my last question, which I declare the most important question of this panel, which is, where do we stand now with the objectives that were at the onset of the cool down project? And that was to ensure that the scale up of carbon removals does not interfere with due investment and ambition to reduce emissions. Now, we've heard there is some thinking at the Commission not to rule out offsetting with permanent removals. We've got voices here that say not everybody is against integration of CDR in the ETS because it's an instrument we have. It's the sort of closest solution at our, in inverted commas, at our disposal. But nevertheless, with all the work now that we've done in the course of the project and the proposals that we have now, are we any more advanced? Are we any further? Do we have a clearer picture of how to pursue two goals without one impinging on the other? And I'd like an answer to this one question from all of you to finish up before we open for questions. Thank you.
Happy to start. I mean, sadly, I don't think there's a straight high-level answer. I don't think we came up with the idea that if you build this sweeping scheme, then you can address all these problems at once. I think we just need to be vigilant, and I think this question about mitigation deterrence specifically comes in the details of policy design. I personally believe that this can be managed quite effectively through an appropriately designed ETS cap when the ETS is relevant, through a separate target, through things like how you design sustainability standards under CRCF to avoid leakage, how you think about which CDR methods are eligible within the compliance schemes and how those interact in terms of price relative to the cost of abatement. But yeah, I think it's just making sure that all those pieces are together rather than looking for kind of this embedded answer in a sort of high level framework, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think there are still many open questions, but I would say we have advanced because Alice already mentioned that we were so many different people, different backgrounds in the room discussing, exchanging ideas, perspectives, and I think that's really crucial in answering those questions. So I think in that regard, we made progress.
So I think we need specific targets for CDR. Referred today was one of the principles in this co-creation process. So separate targets for permanent CDR, biogenic rules, and emission reductions. That's one part of the story. The other part is funding commitments. And funding commitments do not necessarily have to mean that money is actually going out the door. I mentioned guarantees earlier, but there's a large role for guarantees. I think, including from the European Investment Bank, to really unlock more private investments. So I think that's my 2 cents. Yeah, thank you.
And on my side, I would say that we should be a little bit cautious. First of all, on the offsetting, I don't say the Commission is supporting offsetting. There are different views on the offsetting at the level of Commission. I just say that from a personal point of view, I think it's fair. It's fair to ask for a little bit of recognition when you invest massively on the carbon removals, and there is different way for this recognition. But yeah, maybe in some context, specific context, offsetting can potentially be an option. And on the question of abatement versus emission reductions versus carbon removal, we should not oppose them too much, because when you think about the different solution to reduce emissions and the different solution for carbon removal, there are also overlaps. So I fully agree that the priority should be to decarbonization of electricity. So wind, solar, as much as we can, wherever we can. I fully agree on that. But we have also to recognize that maybe we cannot electrify 100% everything in Europe. When you need heat for industrial processes, for instance, on this kind of things, electricity alone cannot do it. And then the question is, what do we want to achieve? If you don't use carbon removal, what are and you set aside solar and wind. Again, I fully support the maximum development on that. We have energy policy for this, and I think we should continue to develop on that. But what are the other options to decarbonize industry? Using more biomass, replacing fossil with biomass. Is it what we want to do? Doing CCS, to capture CO₂ emissions and to do CCS. And there is an overlap with carbon records that is also doing CCS. Reducing the demand. Do we want to have a policy that are reducing the demand? We have, of course, some people will say, let's be cautious with that. What else? What are the solutions besides solar and wind? Where fully agree, maximum support. But then when you look at the other options, using hydrogen, some people will say that is very energy intensive, and it can be also an issue. So where do you put carbon removals in the spectrum of all the abatement solutions that you have? Do you always put them at the very end, or do you think that there is a carbon removal to be in the mix on that once we have electrified as much as possible using wind and solar?
Thank you very much, Fabien. I take it there was some bait in this last statement, which is a good segue to the Q&A. So, dear audience, are you revved up? Do you have questions at the tip of your tongues? I take a few questions from the audience, and then I'll ask what questions there are online. Martin from Fern first, please. And please introduce yourself briefly and say if your question is addressed to anybody in particular.
Well, thank you. Martin Pigeon, indeed, from Fern, and a very happy former participant to the process, actually, which I left more or less halfway, and for a very simple reason, is because of the targets for non-natural removals. Because of one issue, which is the sequencing. And the sequencing is very important. Atilla, you mentioned the recent floods in Southeast Asia. And Reuters this morning was reporting about that, especially in Sumatra, where the floods were made worse by deforestation. The deforestation in that place was made largely driven by palm oil plantations or biofuels. Biofuels tend to cause more greenhouse gas emissions than fossil fuels, yet they're counted as zero in the EU energy sector, and enormous additional demand is expected because of the long-term mandatory demand signal, the very one we've heard that industry needs so much. And that signal has been sent by EU legislation on the aviation and maritime sectors. So whatever gets scaled needs to be genuine removals from the atmosphere that come in addition to what the rest of the land sector are doing. And we've been there, but the CRCF currently does not ensure that because it is very constrained by existing EU legislation. That's in the human writing. Fabien, you mentioned it. The Red Post 2030 is being opened next year. Great. And this process will largely determine actually how credible the new carbon removals policy will be. So I question in the form of a plea actually to the Commission in this case is, can you please convince your colleague to propose that primary woody biomass and crops are excluded from sustainability criteria, and that there is a strict compliance with countries' EU targets. Because if this is not done, then biomass-based removal activities such as bio-CCS or biochar will happen mostly at the expense of the existing carbon sinks. And that can, of course, be guaranteed to deliver carbon removals in the atmosphere, and that means they should simply not be scaled. Thank you.
That's a very big question and a big issue, and I don't think I'm going to combine it with other questions, but put it straight to Fabien. You won't have heard this for the first time, but how do you respond to this key?
Yeah, so my answer is going to be very short. So our colleagues from DG are responsible of the Renewable Energy Directive. There will be a consultation to look at what potential, what aspect of the Renewable Energy Directive can be potentially optimized, let's say, and let's see what will be the proposal. But yeah, I cannot say much more for now.
Okay. Question of demarcation of responsibilities, Martin. Yeah, please go on and collect some more questions. Ulrika.
Hello, my name is Ulrika. I'm from Can Europe. My question is also to Fabien. There's also welcome to turn. Going back to the initial proposal that we've been looking at. So I assume Commission is also thinking already something beyond what is now coming to the table, the ETS integration, etc. So what's the next step? What do you think? There is some potential for something like this, what we have now proposed?
So the Commission is definitely thinking about other policies to support the development of carbon removal and the role of carbon removal in the policies. So the ETS one, so you all know, we are working on that and we are looking at what is possible. But we have also next year the revision of the member state targets and what could be the potential role of removal on that. We are working on the designing a purchasing program. Here I'm talking about options. I don't say at all that the Commission will go this way, but one option is, can we find a way to use the potential purchasing program developed for the future through finance partially by member states that could help member states to achieve their target. I think this is something that you put also in your proposal. You at certain point, I saw on your slide some option for member states. If they purchase carbon removal, they can account this carbon removal for the member state target. I think that it's something that we need to think about. Is it something that is feasible? How it could look like? And let's see how the discussion looks. So this is just one example to say that it's not only about ETS, it's also about other policies and what could be the role of the other policies. The specific case of a removal compliance scheme, I think in the near term, it's quite difficult. The current context is quite difficult to put that in. You mentioned some challenges. Who will pay for that? Who will be obliged for this scheme? And yeah, I'm not sure that in the future it will be easier to discuss. But advice.
Thank you, Fabien. Yeah, next question. Let's take perhaps a couple or three, and maybe there are questions for other panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually have a question to the other
participants. Thanks, Kaya Redner from Perspectives Climate Group. And I was very interested to hear your points on the difficulties for permanent removals in the VCM currently. And at the same time, I'm wondering if we're now talking about a potential compliance scheme, could the VCM be sort of a way towards such a compliance scheme? So I wanted to ask whether you have considered this, and also what conditions you think need to improve and what needs to happen on the VCM for this to be an option. And I think maybe there are things also to what Mr. Ramos says, that I'm wondering, could this be an option an alternative option towards recognizing the effort of companies on carbon removals under the ETS? So just an open question on what alternatives you've been considering. Thank you.
Let's see, do we have another question to take at this point?
Hi everyone, it's Oğuz from Climate and Environment Association Europe. Where does emerging or draft carbon dioxide removal market sit within the borders of bigger sustainable finance framework? Is it completely independent market, having different objectives and different actors, mechanism, elements, or it's an integrated or internal part of component of the sustainable finance framework and mechanism? I don't know who is targeting, but maybe more than one speakers. So thank you.
Okay, I think they are big enough questions to tackle. So first question I take is between Silke and Atilla to answer that one. Isn't there more scope with the VCM to bring about a development towards a compliance scheme?
Thank you. I'll just quickly summarize perhaps an essential link to the compliance issue, but I'll let Silke speak about the VCM and the SBTi. So first of all, no, we don't think that the VCM, so to say, could give reward to compliance in 2030, for example, just because we don't see those signals. And as I said earlier, many companies right now are struggling to get the first deal done, first of all. Secondly, those who are in the VCM in the market do still need to combine several revenue streams. And so that's why we say we support the Commission's proposal to come forward with a purchasing program, a program that sort of say will jumpstart for additional buyers to come in. Right now, VCM is highly concentrated. 80% of total volumes are focused on one single buyer. And so we're not seeing those second-tier buyers coming in yet. So hoping that with the purchasing program, we could facilitate and incentivize additional groups of buyers to come in. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe just to add on that, VCM is also seeing, or there have been many schedules and many issues, and I think it's important to learn from those and to also learn from the work that's already been done. So to that extent, I think the VCM can sort of serve as, maybe spring is a bit of a big word, but I think we can take the lessons learned, we can look at the standards that are there and improve them where it's necessary. But I think it should really be also governments setting standards, regulating it, and ensuring that CDR projects adhere to those environmental and social standards.
Thank you. You want to supplement the answer? No? You have another question? Okay, then we answer the question first that was already answered, and I feel, Fabien, you may be the most suitable to answer it. Whether you can give a satisfactory answer is a different one. Let's try it nevertheless. So the question was, where does CDR finance sit in the overall framework of sustainability finance? How does it fit with other needs for sustainability finance?
Yeah. So, well, there is different elements on to reply to that. So first of all, the CDR depends also what you are in mind when you talk about sustainable finance investments. Are you talking about technologies? Are you talking about projects? Are you talking about different approaches? Technologies, if I take the example of technologies, the taxonomy. So the taxonomy is a tool to support more sustainable finance. And in taxonomy, you have different, let's say, categories of supported. You have, for instance, for industrial carbon management, you have something related to CCS. When you want to do DAX or bio-CCS, of course, you have a CCS component. So there, from a technology perspective, it fits to what we have on existing instruments. For direct air capture, there is not a category direct air capture on that. There is a category for research and innovation, or I don't remember exactly how it's called. And currently, it fits in this category. The question is, in the future, when we start to have a bit more of development, commercial potential of that activity, maybe it would be worth to think about creating a specific category for direct air capture. Then after you have the problem also is that for carbon removal, there are so many different approaches. When you talk about the ocean alkalinity investment, Atilla mentioned it just before, we are at all in the same type of technology that you need than the one that I just mentioned. And the discussion is currently much less advanced than for bio-CCS or DAC. So it's a bit of a case by case, I would say.
Thanks a lot. You did very much better than I thought you could do on this question. Now we're turning to questions online, and I hand the mic to Daniel. We have two questions. Maybe let's take them together.
Yes. In the interest of time, we picked out two questions. One would be for the panel, and one would be directed to Fabiola about the proposal itself. So the question on the panel from him online is, I'd be interested to hear reflections on what a catalytic portfolio looks like for the next 5 years. How do we best spend the limited pilot procurement budget?
What a catalytic portfolio would look like.
How do we best spend limited pilot procurement budget?
Is that one for you, Francesca?
Yeah, I think maybe Atilla I'll pass back to you in a sec. But yeah, it's a difficult question. I think the catalytic part is getting private companies to come on board in the short term as much as possible. And I know that might be a compromise position for some, but I think spending public money in a way that gets buyers, either existing buyers or to venture into new purchases, or new buyers to feel safe purchasing CDR units and feel like they're de-risked. So I think mentioned kind of a feeling of wanting to go to projects that have a track record, so government needs to come in and allow that to be kind of de-risked. But in terms of the specific portfolio, maybe I'll pass to you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, in short, the portfolio we believe should be as broad as possible, covering different pathways and projects. However, I'm afraid it will assist my lead question. So I'll just say that if full offtakes are not possible in current times and under current budget constraints, one viable way is to provide per ton subsidies. It will help private voluntary buyers to do offtakes and more offtakes. I think the short-term goal for a person program should be to bring in as many suppliers and as many buyers as possible under limited budget constraints.
Thank you. Fabiola, are you already clear about the question asked of you, or do we need to repeat it?
Yeah, we didn't say that.
Oh, you didn't say it. Sorry.
We didn't even say it yet, so there's the question to you. Online, regarding the EU Permanent Pilot Procurement Program, can you expand on the short-term demand sources? For example, before the next MFF, you mentioned private monetary targets, member state national removal targets. What could these look like?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think so. We have some suggestions in the proposal which don't go too far, but the idea was that in order to pull funding for a procurement program, we need, as also said, a mix of public and private finance. The idea was member states to have the possibility to finance, contribute to the funding for the program, and get in return some units that could be used towards their national removal targets, if any. And then for the private sector, the idea was, and then I think this links to the question that I wanted to ask the panel, so I think I'll ask it as well. The idea there was, again, in order to avoid offsetting, only relying on offsetting, we could try to suggest an approach based on giving back to companies decided to voluntarily participate in this program, giving them certificates for having contributed to and participated to this program that they can then use towards potential monetary targets for permanent removals. But this is really like, yeah, a basic suggestion that also should be looked into further. And so I also have a quick question, if we have still time on this specifically, maybe if anyone in the panel could elaborate on this, which is, so Fabien also mentioned it's hard to go beyond offsetting because normally companies are not willing to not having anything in exchange for paying for removals. I'm wondering, is it and I know that the Commission is also talking to buyers, potential buyers, more in a workshop, but is it really not possible to find ways to go beyond the offsetting scheme and trying, for example, alternatives such as certificates or monetary targets for removals? Are companies really only willing to pay removals just to offset their ongoing emissions? Is there anything that we can do also, for example, in the SBTi context for that? And maybe, it was interesting for me to go back to the cost of the remote compliance scheme, because I know that Francesca looked into this question. I think it's interesting, but we might not have too much time.
It's a question that we're well familiar with, right? We have been in the business of popularizing contribution claims to replace offsets in the long time, and we face the same challenge for the carbon removals world. After all, what is an offset? I mean, it is now it's a financial asset, but essentially it's just a claim. It's just a statement. It's something that has been created as a financial asset over time. It's a man-made asset. So how could a carbon removal become an asset that is not an offset, that is just a contribution in the end? It seems more a management and communications challenge. But yeah, please.
Yeah, very happy. I think, I like that you send view than what you just expressed. First, the CSCF is not an offsetting scheme. That's to be very clear. The Commission with the CSCF provided a scheme to certify the quality of carbon removal. And from that point, you can do different things with this certificate. What I wanted to say is that it's not that I want to support offset and saying that we should move towards offsetting everything. It's not at all what I want to say. It's just that we need to find a way for the people that invest in carbon removal that they can have a way to be recognized for that simply. And you are saying that, sometimes some people say it's a matter of semantic, it's a matter of communication. So for me, I think I have the feeling that we spend a lot of energy in this discussion for, at the end, for what purpose? Using the word contribution instead of offset, and everything is different. I don't know. I understand the concern, but I think the most important at the level where we are now, the stage where we are now with carbon removal, we need people, the few people that are ready to invest in that, and Atilla mentioned it, and there are not so many. I think we should support them in their investment and find a way for them to be recognized for that. And if offsetting is really a problem, a word that's problematic. Let's try to find something else that can satisfy everyone.
Okay, ingenuity is required. That's what we take away. Let's find that ingenuity. We're running out of time. Oh, sorry, you still wanted, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Yes,
Okay.
just quickly, I do think the terminology offsetting and also utilization is problematic, because what we see is that the companies who are currently heavily investing in durable removals, that's mostly the tech sector, they usually have net zero targets for 2030 or 2040 quite early. But these net zero targets, they are not underpinned by deep emission reduction commitments. And I think in these cases, also the company's investments in removals serves as a distraction from their rising emissions. And I do think we should be very careful with the terminology and move away from this offsetting.
Now I have to turn to Fabiola to get some clues as to how strict I need to be with time. We have one more question online that I think is really worth considering, and I see three more hands in the room. What do you say, Fabiola?
I guess.
Am I disciplinarian
on
or
how hungry people are to go to lunch?
Okay, how hungry are you? This hungry, this hungry, this hungry. Okay, I see some indications that you're more hungry for questions than for food. Then let's take the online question and the 3 questions in the room, and then Fabiola will wrap up with some final remarks.
So there's another question we have for the panel. The proposal suggests that the removal compliance scheme applies to ETS participants from 2030 to 2040. And post 2050 over emitters and large value added low carbon installations. Could you clarify who you expect to be covered entities? And would this be sector agnostic or specific? And also why, ideally?
Covered entities already covered last week.
Can you repeat the question?
It's about who would be covered entities and why specifically ETS participants from 2030 and 40 are in the removal compliance scheme, and post 2050 over emitters and large value added sectors, low carbon installations. Could you clarify who you expect to be covered entities? And would this be sector agnostic or specific?
I can also provide a very general answer. Saying that I think the idea there was really to try to apply the polluter pays and ability to pay principles as much as possible. So starting in the shorter term by obliging those companies who have the higher share of emissions, but then when those emissions hopefully decline, then we need to apply another kind of principle to that. And so those companies who are able to pay, they should contribute. So very generally, that was the idea. And we kind of were sector agnostic, I think, but there is at least a suggestion to have fossil fuel producers and suppliers to pay for that, especially for also overshoot management. There are specific suggestions in, I think it's page 15 of the report.
Thank you, Fabiola. Wayne, and then collect the last few questions from the back of the room for us.
So hello, I'm Pietro Casa from Green Star Capital, and so I was thinking again about the possibility of including like CDRs as a compliance credit into the ETS, and of course it would be I agree that it would be better to have like separate targets for reduction and removals. But I was also thinking that if CDRs were to be added to the ETS, they could like two systems could also strengthen each other in terms of maybe pricing and financing. Because like my assumption was that to make the inclusion make any sense, like the price of one UA and one credit of CDR, like one ton of CO2 removed, should be brought kind of close to each other. meaning that either EUAs should move up in price or CDRs should lower in price. So yeah, my question is, do you think that that will be the case, and if there will be a positive outcome, and also if there will be ways to achieve this through alternative schemes, alternative systems? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the room agrees, but my personal view is that you hit the nail on the head, and that there's an economic intuitiveness to including CDRs and ETS that there perhaps isn't with creating a sort of up-ramping scheme of a removal trading scheme rather than a down-ramping scheme of an ETS. I think that heavily is conditional on how you design the cap in the ETS. And I know that I always reference UK, and maybe this isn't the right room, but the UK at least has a cap that it plans to maintain, and any removals traded in that scheme would be beneath the cap in the sense that it wouldn't dilute ambition. And I think that's a really important condition for this working for the climate. Any alternative would obviously dilute pricing, dilute ambition, and not be good for the climate, and probably not for removals because you're not driving up prices. So there's a version of ETS consideration that I personally think works. That helps also push the cost of removals as much as possible onto emitters as you drive up price, and minimise the cost to the taxpayer. But yeah, I'm also happy to discuss that options.
Any more hands?
Hi, Rebecca Brown from Carbon Pulse. I was just wondering, so the EU institutions are on the verge of potentially approving to delete climate plans for companies, I think next week. And so I was wondering what impact this has on demand for CDR, and should the Commission consider reintroducing mandatory climate plans for companies? Because otherwise, why would companies buy CDR?
I suppose you refer to the corporate sustainability regulation. Yeah. On this, I'm not following this file very closely, so I prefer to, yeah, unfortunately, I will not be able to reply directly to your question. But yes, we need to find a reason for companies to support CDR, thanks to what you said already.
I see no more hands now. The curiosity of the audience has been satisfied, it seems, and I think it's time for a big round of applause for our brilliant panel. Thank you very much. And I'll hand back over to Fabiola for closing remarks on the event before we'll all join and spend some time together on a nice lunch.
Thank you so much. So I don't really have much to add. I think it was I found it a quite interesting event. I'm really grateful for everyone who participated in the cool down process, who took time and effort to work on the proposal and to discuss together, and to be here today as well to speak, to present and speak in the panel. I think financing removals in general, actually not only permanent removals, but also how to incentivize action in the so-called temporary removals remains another question, and it's a challenge that we should together try to address. I think what was great to hear from this process and also today is that probably we agree much more than we would think on many issues. We all agree, I think, that we need to be very careful about the climate and environmental integrities of integrity of these schemes. We can't afford just slowing down ambition in reducing emissions, but at the same time, we kind of need to look into how to develop instruments to develop and deploy a sustainable supply of carbon removals. But at the same time, we also agreed on the fact that that public authorities, that the EU should have a big role in this, in overseeing and managing and governing any instruments that deal with carbon removals, and that the private sector, that companies can do their part in this. How to do that remains still open. I'm glad that the Commission has plans to work on this further next year, and I hope we can keep working together on this topic. And once again, thank you very much for being with us. Thanks for those who joined online, and maybe see you again next year. Let's see. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.